Dan, welcome to Atlanta.
Appreciate it.
So I've been talking to so many people about power. Why I'm interested in talking to you is all of those folks are representing a technology. What I'm hoping with our conversation, with the exception of maybe Christine King and Chris from the INL, although they're nuclear, it's more open aperture. But everybody else is representing a technology.
Yep.
When they're in that chair, I'm believing all of them. Yes, of course. Let's do that now. And then I'll talk to somebody with an adjacent or maybe even further away technology, and they'll give some lip service like, well, of course the natural gas, or of course the whatever, hydrogen intermittent, they have good intentions and we got to do something. But really what you should be thinking about is something else. And so to have somebody with your perspective that has this broader, I don't know, view or vision or whatever, I'm hoping we get an additional conversation that helps kind of color it in. So can we start off with who you are and who you're with now? And do me a favor, pull this mic to where it's a little bit closer to you. You just pull it right up there.
How's that?
Yeah, that's good.
That works.
All right. Take it away.
So Dan Crosby, grew up on the West Coast.
Where?
So
exactly?
Bay Area. All my family is from Southern California. In fact, everybody in my family either went to USC or Stanford. I was born at Stanford.
Oh, nice.
My dad always wanted to go to the East Coast for school. So he told me when I was a freshman in high school, I had to go more than 1,000 miles away to college. So I talked my best friend from high school in Oregon to go into Baylor with me.
Oh, wow.
Then decided halfway through summer, once he was already there, that I couldn't go to Baylor. I just didn't want to live in Waco. And so I went to Auburn sight unseen.
Wow.
Literally first day in the
War
state
Eagle.
of Alabama. War Eagle. First day in the state of Alabama was 3 days before class started.
Wow. Why Auburn?
I had met some folks at a camp that had gone to Auburn, and I thought, what the heck?
Yeah.
I'll go try something new. So absolutely loved it.
So that's how you went to school. That's where you went to school.
Yep.
So
started
how'd you get into
construction-
energy?
Yeah, so I started a construction company after college. I lived in Atlanta for a little bit, then moved to Nashville. Everything blew up in '08. Literally moved to Dallas with nothing, sleeping on a couch. I was sleeping on my truck at one point. So I actually got into energy through a waiting tables job that I was doing at night while working for a PE
As good a reason as any.
Yeah. So started at a small shop, and it was kind of one of there's your phone and that's your cubicle, good luck jobs, and that was your training.
Right.
Then got recruited by another group. They forcefully moved me to the Northeast, and I'd picked up a bunch of national accounts and really wanted to focus on real-time data. And so then started another retail group for another company, and my focus was really helping big industrials understand how they're using energy in real time, how does that interact with markets in real time. And really, to make those two things work, you got to understand the infrastructure in the middle. And so I left in 2014 and started Legend with $2,000 next to my bed in New York. So it's been a journey.
Half a month's rent. That's what was so. I guess what I get. You just want a job, so you start. But what's attractive about staying? Like, this is not energy. Is a really polite way to phrase that industry, because it's hard. Like, it's always volatile. We lived in Houston a few times. My folks are still there. Now, he was in the aerospace NASA business, but all our neighbors are either oil and gas business or they were in aerospace. And both of those have their cycles. And usually when it's painful, it's really painful. So what attracted you to stay?
I guess a couple of things. So one, I'm a nerd. So even in construction, I'd always, wanted to build power plants, and infrastructure and heavy industrial always fascinated me.
Yeah.
And so one of the cool parts about this business, I've gotten to tour everything from bomb-making factories to EV plants to chicken plants to sand mines to LNG terminals, you name it. So I've always been fascinated with just kind of how things work.
Yeah.
But to your point, electricity is the most inelastic commodity on Earth.
Right.
So especially at transmission level voltage and some of these bigger loads, it's violent. And that's something that I think a lot of people in the data center space are just starting to understand, because most of those projects for a long time that were deregulated were all distribution voltage type projects. And so managing that risk and then managing the volatility that just exists within industrial environments where things can catastrophically fail. There's all sorts of big shifts that are happening shift to shift, day to day, week to week. and really understanding how those two things can interconnect better.
Yeah.
And then what kind of infrastructure is required to be able to do that. We were looking at a project earlier today, actually, with the team of a group of our customer who we started out with infrastructure and actually put in the infrastructure the way we wanted to, and then started interacting with commodity markets the way we wanted to. And now they're acquiring a competitor that did it the normal way.
Right.
And there's a massive cost difference to the tune of over $1 million a year in just the way that the whole thing was set up from the beginning of what they can even do, period.
Yeah.
And interacting with those markets. And so that whole interaction of how all those things work has just always been fascinating to me. It's always continuing to evolve. The gen stack has massively shifted over the last 20 years. And so it just keeps my ADD in check.
It's what a phenomenal opportunity for somebody like you. And now you've got these data centers. Somebody just said to me the other day, they were like, picture in your mind back when we led the world in manufacturing steel or whatever. We had a big smelter. Those substations, those big massive plants were maybe 30 to 50 megawatts. I think I've got 30 megawatts on my ashtray in my truck outside. Like it's our facilities, not everybody has facilities like ours. Some of them are more modest. 20 years later, we say 30 megawatts is modest or 40 megawatts is modest. But I have facilities that in an N+1 configuration with all transformers out there, they're 120 megawatt in a building. And I got four buildings on that site with other campuses that are growing larger than that. And so really it's moved into urban planning mode. And you're right. So if not distribution voltage, for sure we would have it step down to medium voltage and then step down again to distribution. And you had some specialists, like we never touched the high voltage. That would be the utility on the front end of the substation. And we would step it down and then step it down. But still, 150, 225, 13,000, it's all going to hurt you if you're not an expert in that area, even distribution, as you know. And now some of the requirements, especially, and I'm sure we'll get to this in the conversation, with the technology at the end of it, that may need, like there's real conversations, I don't know, we'll dive into it today, but there's conversations about, well, should we keep distributing in AC? Should we do it to DC? And what's the, we'll see where that goes. But the point is that we're having a moment. These, whether it's AI only or all these other things, it's really putting a pressure, it feels like, I would say unprecedented. I've only been doing this for 20, 30 years. But why do you think, like right now, this is all going on?
Well, we could talk about this for 5 hours, but there's a massive confluence of things that have happened, right? So, you have a period from like 1950 to the early 2000s where power growth and consumption is just up and to the right. And then you have this 20-year period where power consumption is pretty much flat because efficiency is just totally gobbling up load growth.
Right.
And LEDs, VFDs, all this controls. To your point on DC, we saw a decent push in the office space of trying to move a lot of stuff to DC. In fact, where all the lights on a floor are all PoE.
Right.
Just because the power density of all that stuff has imploded.
Right.
At the same time, on a macro level, and really over the last 10 years or less, there's been a huge intensification of electricity in the oil field. So a lot of things that were running on diesel and generation have all moved to high line, from drilling to all the way to frac is now a lot mobile.
I don't think a lot of people not in that business know that. I've never heard that.
It's exploded. So like West Texas, if you look at the West Texas grid in 2020, 2021, it was a 3.5 to 4 gig grid. It's a 7 gig grid now. They're talking about that adding 20 gigs. So the electrification of that is just wildly intense. And this is kind of the thermodynamics of life, right? Is there's no free lunch, and to get energy, which is what E&P business is doing, you got to put energy in to get more refined and denser energy out. And so that has exploded. At the same time, you have a massive growth of electric vehicles. So the manufacturing of those is much more electrically intense than manufacturing gas-powered vehicles. And then obviously running them is all electric.
Right.
And you've seen a little bit of a move back toward hybrid in that space. And then in parallel to that, and really in the last, I would say 4 years, you've seen a huge intensification of electricity in the data center space, just as far as the density, right?
Yeah.
And you've been through that world, much longer than I have, and much more upfront. Been around the space since probably '08, but
Right.
you've gone from 5 megawatt data centers to 10 to 50, and then all of a sudden there's just been this massive jump to 100 to 2 gigs. Where that curve has, kind of gone logarithmic in the last, year and a half, 2 years.
Yeah.
And so that is reverberating across everything. And the way that a lot of things have been done in the past is all of a sudden becoming a problem. And there's several reasons for that. I think one is you have a whole lot of people that are now in the power business that didn't know what an electron was and a
Right.
data center was 3 years ago.
Right.
That are just, I need 1,500 megawatts of power and I need it like, 6 to 8 months? Does that
Right.
work? And the utility's just kind of looking at them like, are you serious?
Right.
And so that's creating a whole group of problems. One, there's a gold rush of all these people that are trying to get powered land because there's insane profits, and we've helped some folks make
Right.
silly, like triple-digit millions in
Right.
months by figuring that process out.
Right.
That's drying up, fortunately. That's totally changed the way utility queues operate on the load side, and utilities are having to deal with things that we kind of saw a bit of a precursor to in the Bitcoin, craze like 5 years ago. But if you put up capital limits, and even the data centers like made them prepay, enter and exit
Right.
plus however many months. And
That's right.
so you could protect yourself. The capital here, you can't.
Right.
I mean, writing $1 million check for a load study is like, yeah, whatever, here you go.
I think, apologies for interrupting, but
No,
I
you're
think also in the Bitcoin, so many people didn't know, who is this? It wasn't
Right.
just their money. They're like, who is this? Now, when you have IBM,
Exactly.
Microsoft, Google,
Yep.
Apple, Oracle, Amazon, whoever, Meta, and not checks with an M, but checks with a B.
Yeah.
And these are people who know what power are, and these are people, and all of a sudden the utility is like,
Yeah.
like it's almost like goosebumps. Like, what's going on? Like, what did we miss? What are we not prepared for? To your point, was a lot of growth a while ago, then flat as if we got these efficiencies,
Yep.
and all of a sudden, all these people showing up with not some possible idea with. I don't think Bitcoin's wrong. I think it's just probably early, and it'll sort itself out. But now you've got these credentialed people showing up, and they're like, "Whoa, what's happening?"
Yep. Yeah, no, and it's not just the hyperscalers. It's major banks. It's
Sure.
anybody that's tangentially related to real estate. And a lot of these are, very legitimate, big
Right.
capital sources that, can put up the capital. The problem is like what's going on in South Dallas with Encore. There's 40 gigawatts of interconnection requests. We know that's not all real. A lot of it's, double, triple, quadruple redundant of people going after the same load.
Oh, I see.
And that's completely gridlocked
Right.
a lot of utility queues.
Right.
And a lot of people are kind of shocked at the lead time on transmission assets, but this is the whole reason you have rolling blackouts, right? You don't order a 300 megawatt or 500 megawatt transformer, it shows up in 6 months. And so this is why the grid does such drastic things to protect itself.
Right.
And so now those lead times are moving from 3 years to 5, and everybody thinks that's crazy, but it's not with what everybody's allegedly doing right now. And I think that's kind of the crux of what's behind this is, AI absolutely feels like the internet all over again to a magnitude higher.
Right.
But what does that timeline look like? There has to be some kind of bump in this road. Like it doesn't,
Right.
and I don't know the future,
Right.
but to me, at some point, there's going to be a bit of a hiccup. Does this go long term? I absolutely believe it does, but
Right.
I don't think that's perfectly smooth for a whole lot of reasons.
Right.
Markets, infrastructure, capital, demand.
Right.
Like there's a lot of moving pieces here that all need to be perfectly aligned for there to be no bump in the road.
Yeah.
And I don't see
Well,
that happening.
there's some bumps. We've talked about it on the show before, and it's worth repeating here. When we put all that fiber in the late 90s, early 2000s in the ground, to your point about this feels like the internet all over again, magnified.
Yep.
And then we had the bubble.
Yep.
Well, in 2005, we essentially thought, well, that rush is over. What we didn't know was, no, it was just early. And then it was, it just wasn't that was like a flash flood. Then it sort of settled, and then people began noticing sort of an accelerated tide rising.
Getting soaked. Yep.
That's right. And now, not dissimilar to power, people are reaching for fiber. And this middle mile, they get fooled because so much fiber is coming into the metro area because you got control over that. Really, you're a few counties. You've got probably at most a governor that's working with that, as opposed to middle mile or long haul, which are at least state usually in nature, multiple states usually, across a wide divide of geography and all these other things. And so that's much harder because all those right-of-ways that had space before, they don't have space anymore. So you have to do new right-of-ways, or they're filled with solar or whatever the states have decided this is valuable to do. So we see that, and my fiber guys are like, look, you guys are always talking about power. You should talk about this too. I agree with them. But if we're talking about power and transmission, so that's sort of setting it up. Utilities are like, what's going on? We have a process and procedure for a more even the most crazy estimates 5 years ago. Nobody could imagine this sort of rocket ship.
Right.
And we don't see, even with that 30-year ago backdrop in mind, where is it popping? Like, who is it? And to your point about the interconnects, somebody's told me that before, but I forgot because I'm not close to it. I'll bet you my Dallas team is, and my development team is, but I forgot about that. These interconnects can be hallucinating. Like, it's not 40 gigawatts or whatever it is of actual draw or megawatts of draw. It's 2 deals that 5 people are trying to position themselves for, or whatever.
It's a gold rush.
It's a gold rush. And so we're fooling ourselves into this, but there's only so many veins, there's only so many pickaxes and whatever. I guess I got 2 questions here, however you want to answer them, but how do we get sophisticated about determining what's a mirage? Whether I'm a person who's asking for it, we'd like to think of ourselves as sophisticated, depends on who you ask, or you're the utility or the provider, whoever. I mean, even if I'm going to do it for myself, and I hope we're going to get to microgrids in a little bit, but I don't want to fool myself either. I don't want to fool or misrepresent, with all the best intentions, utility. So how do you develop a sophistication with determining what's real and what's not, number one? And then the second is transmission. So often we talk about generation, but whatever the mix is, transmission seems like, at least what I've heard, it's at least equally hard. So however you want to tackle those.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of challenges within that, right? So the first one is, the way that interconnections have always worked is basically been a queue, and who gets in the queue first gets power. But the reality is utilities in almost every part of the country have been long power, and they're in the business of selling power. And so I put in a request. I'm probably building some big industrial facility that's going to take several years to build, which gives the utility plenty of time to plan, and you figure out what your payment for whatever needs to be done, and you go through that process. And there's a lot of things that we've done in the past to socialize certain parts of that and really engineer and optimize what that's going to look like going forward. So where that's really shifting now is all of a sudden, literally within the last 24 months, almost every utility in the United States is now net short power and has a queue bigger than they know how to serve. And they're figuring out very quickly that I don't really think all of this queue is real.
Right.
So that's creating a bifurcation again in how regulated and deregulated markets function, because deregulated markets operate differently than regulated markets, where regulated's got to go through a rate case and all this other stuff to be able to justify putting something into the rate base to serve customers, which now is a specific private entity.
Right.
And public, or the deregulated markets, which handle it very differently, where they're basically connecting deregulated suppliers with deregulated consumers.
Is it regulated? I'm presuming is much more common than deregulated, or is that
yes and no. So like Texas for power, Texas is deregulated, Illinois, and then the PJM market, other than Indiana and West Virginia, and then all the way up into New England, except for Vermont, is all deregulated. There is quasi-deregulation in a bunch of markets like Michigan and Arizona and California, Oregon.
Right.
And then there's obviously wholesale wheeling.
So it's a
that can be done.
tapestry. It's not a slam dunk to say.
It's totally nuanced.
Yeah, I got you.
And like in Georgia's technically deregulated in who you choose out of the gate. And then all of them are using the same transmission grid. And there's, like in Georgia, there's capacity issues with generation, but there is a decent amount of transmission still available.
Right.
So all of this is very, very nuanced. And it's really been interesting to watch the shift of, we've been doing interconnections for, I've been in the space for 15 years.
Right.
So that's all rapidly evolving, and the utility's trying to figure out how to deal with that. And some of that's going to sort itself out. But part of the problem right now is the utility has come to understand that if I give you that 500 megawatt interconnection, I literally just put $100 million in your pocket for nothing.
Right.
Or whatever I charged you to do a study.
That's kind of
it's insane.
We're friends. Let's not be vulgar about the description, man. Come on.
So that's the challenge is now you're like, it's kind of becoming a lottery to who gets that piece first. And so and what the interesting things and actually this came out in a conversation 2 weeks ago with the utility, is they basically said, listen, we're not doing first come, first serve in the queue anymore. Who are you? Are you a hyperscaler that's about to build a data center and you're actually going to move forward with this? You're going to put the capital up. We're going to put you ahead of, Joe, who's
not as recognizable, right?
Right. And that's a challenging thing, but at the same time, they have to figure out how to sort this out.
In the meantime, sorry to interrupt. I keep doing it, but it just seems to me like, look, until we get more sophisticated in evaluating who's asking, I'm going with the most creditworthy, most cash balanced, whatever.
Yep.
And probably there will be additional adjustments in what they ask for their customer. Where before, 5 years ago, if you asked for an interconnect, okay, this is your obligation. It's probably pretty modest, all things considered. And now, I guarantee you, especially if they think of it as, if not a lottery, certainly extremely valuable, there will be guarantees or there will be mechanisms for whatever it is. Like I'm hearing these conversations all the time. They'll get more sophisticated. But in lieu of some refined process, this is all new for, like we know how to build data centers. They know how to build power. We know how to move electrons. But scale and speed it's a challenge. Like,
Yeah, and the challenge is speed has never been a thing in transmission, right? First off, it's dangerous. And second off, it's just massive components, and almost all of it is custom manufactured, outside of line.
Right.
That most of this stuff is built project specific, just like other huge pieces of industrial equipment. You don't just go pick an arc furnace off the shelf, right?
Well, not with that attitude.
Right.
Come on.
So there's two really interesting dynamics that are happening right now with utilities. So one of them, I think, is what you're alluding to there, is where someone comes and says, listen, there's $100 million in infrastructure that needs to be built here. Here's $100 million. Let's get this built.
Right.
And obviously that's going to move somebody ahead of the queue. And some utilities are going to start requiring that, especially if they're making massive upgrades. Like, we have a project that the infrastructure is like $400 million.
Right.
So when you're doing those kind of massive infrastructure upgrades to a system that, yes, benefit the system, but you're only doing it because this huge load is coming in, a lot of that is going to be less socialized than it was in the past.
Okay.
Now, there are still some utilities that are significantly socializing that. But one of the really interesting dynamics that we've seen over the last 6 months is, in the past, if I'm building a $100 million mine or a $200 million specialty manufacturing system that's going to require transmission interconnection and all this kind of stuff, you're focused on building your stuff, they're building their stuff, whatever, we're all good. And, we know you're long power, you're in the business of selling power. So now we have this totally new dynamic where you have, because those loads that really impact an entire grid system don't show up that often historically, right? And don't show up in any kind of regional density either.
Right.
They're kind of usually in the middle of nowhere and specially built. Well, now all of a sudden, everybody and their brother is building the equivalent of like 2 or 3 arc furnaces.
Right.
And oh, by the way, we all want to be in Dallas, or we all want to be in Atlanta, or we all want to be in Columbus, or we all want to, and it's like, are you serious?
Right.
So the challenge and the flip of that is a lot of these people are willing to go ahead and put up the capital. But one of the challenges that we're seeing with capital, and we're having a lot of due diligence conversations with big people and Wall Street, New York, is they're the ones backing this building that's going to cost $500 to $700 million to build.
Right.
I want to guarantee that the utility is going to build me that infrastructure and get me that power.
Right.
A utility has never gone on the hook for damages in the past. And if you read all their contracts, it's like a lawyer's worst nightmare.
Right.
We're going to get there when we can. We're going to do our best.
They don't know what the word damages is.
We'll
Like, it's not in their lexicon.
Right.
That's right.
And
We'll see when we see.
And you can't expect a utility to take on the risk of a data center's SLA and its build cost. Like, it's crazy.
Right.
Like, and that's the whole thing. The dollar amounts that we're talking about. I mean, people are just throwing around double-digit billions like it's pocket change.
Right.
And so that's creating a really interesting dynamic. And there's some horror stories out there right now of data centers that are starting to build that don't have power in a whole bunch of places. That's starting to reverberate across Wall Street of like, whoa. You know, I got a $400 million half-built building here, and I got no power. What do I do now?
Right.
Which obviously is leading to the microgrid conversation
Right.
we'll have in a minute.
Right.
So everything is really rapidly evolving, and all at the same time. And I think that's I kind of feel like in a lot of ways my life is like the Shawshank Redemption movie where he crawls through the sewer pipe and comes out clean on the other side. As I've spent like 15 years crawling around sand mines and chicken plants and sewer plants and all this garbage. But
only skinny people like you will use that reference. I would just be the clog in the line. Keep going. Keep
I've
going.
always been the wiry guy. But you know, being able to understand gas infrastructure, gas markets, power infrastructure, power generation stack and power markets, and then the regulatory environment.
Right.
And speaking all those things fluently has kind of put me in a fun spot of really being able to watch a massive transition of an industry. And everybody's talking about power, and now we're starting to see a shift of people starting to talk about gas because you can't really separate those. It's the marginal fuel in every part of the U.S.
Yeah.
And the irony in the data center space is, 3 years ago, if I told you that there was a rail line or let alone a rail yard or a gas pipeline, like, forget it, I'm out.
Right.
That's not a data center site.
Yeah.
And now a 42-inch gas line run through the middle of the thing is an asset.
That's right.
Right?
What's funny was we had a conversation, I remember not too long ago, one of our sites, not only those things, but they were so sensitive, you couldn't be on the flight path, anything like that. And not long ago, I was at the conference room talking to these people while we watched planes taking off and landing out the conference window over the building.
Yeah.
Didn't even faze them. Like, it's such a non-issue because things have changed.
Yeah. You just need power.
Yeah.
All I want is there power, and is it not enough? A floodplain still seems to be an issue.
Sure, yeah.
But I mean, is it not in a floodplain? Does it have power? All right, we're in.
Yeah. So is your I mean, there's a lot there, and we could do a podcast just on that. But let me ask you this. So the second part of the question was transmission. So let's not belabor that, except to say, does it even come in to the conversation if you're talking about all of these other things, the fact that getting a transmission of significant distance is as hard as some of these other things that we're talking about. When you're talking about funding, when you're talking about the interconnect and whatever, is it still part of the top hierarchy, or is it more, is this a real opportunity? Whatever the parameters are around the paperwork that we use to do business together, all the funding things that you talked about, the process improvement that has to happen, is this other, while it's important, obviously you're not going to get power without transmission, is it as important, or is it second or third tier to the other conversations?
So I think, the part of that statement, right, is you're not going to get power without transmission. I think people are understanding you can. And I think the fundamental question behind that is this. There's been an absolute gold rush to go find power wherever power is, and power within the next 36 months.
And still going on. It may not be at full force, but it's still going on.
And I think we've seen that start to pull back. And I think this is the core of the question is, do you want, if you need a gigawatt of capacity, do you want 200 megawatts in South Dakota and another 200 megawatts in North Dakota and 200 megawatts in Wisconsin and 200 megawatts in New Mexico, and it's spread all over the world? because that's where that power was available in the next 36 months. Right. And I think that was the thesis for a while. I think we're seeing a pullback of, okay, wait a minute. Do I really want data centers spread all over the place where they're really hard to get to, some of them not even near an interstate, let alone an airport? Right. And we've seen a couple of situations where significant power was found in a very remote area that a hyperscaler thought they wanted, and then was like, wait a minute, do we really want to be just out here in the middle of absolutely nowhere?
Right.
At the same time, Council Bluff and Boardman, Oregon, and Umatilla and all these places up for a long time. But there's also a lot of concentration in those places, right? It's not small.
There's sea cables, there's talent, so whatever the combination of things are that make them attractive.
And the irony is we're calling 200 megawatts small, right? Like that's the world that how
200 megawatts. I don't even get out of bed for 200 megawatts. I know what you mean.
That's how it's shifted.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the fundamental questions. And if the answer to that is yes, we want stuff spread all over the place, then absolutely transmission is going to continue to be a huge problem.
Right.
And I think that's one of the biggest areas that you're going to end up with the NIMBY fight is when you're coming through there, especially with 200 kV class and higher.
Right.
You're asking for a massive right of way that you can't do a whole lot underneath,
right.
and that's a big deal.
Right.
And those are long-term, very expensive projects.
Right.
Like in TVA territory, upgrading the 500 kV system is an 8 to 10 year endeavor, right? And hundreds of millions.
At least hundreds of millions, right?
Yeah. So I think that's really where this kind of crossroads is happening right now. Is a lot of people that are either got jammed up in the utility situation and the utility doesn't have as much power as they thought they did, which is happening a lot. A load letter used to be something that was really solid.
Right.
It's not as solid as it used to be.
Right.
And then two is if you want denser power, people are doing on-site generation.
Right.
And so we're starting to see a big shift on that, and that's really what's pushed the whole drive to gas. In fact, we were working on a project where one of the pipelines is doing an open season on the last part of capacity that's on that pipe, and basically somebody has to step up next week and start paying $600,000 a month for the next 2 years, just so when they actually tap the pipe and get the gas to their site, they have the firm capacity available. And this is the thing, is that's shocking to a lot of people.
Right.
It's the way the gas has always worked.
Right.
Like we've had projects that we literally paid capacity for, and it wasn't hundreds of thousands, but it was $20,000 or $30,000 a month for 3 years.
Right.
Then never built the project and let the capacity go.
Right.
But there was no point in building the project if we didn't know we had capacity. Data centers are learning but this is the way it's always been.
But it's, yes. However, here's what we know. First of all, so let's just transition to the microgrid conversation. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that when we say data centers, it's sort of like saying power companies or whatever. There's a number of people that have come to the data center industry through a variety of backgrounds. Mm-hmm. And those that come from a background where look, the stuff that's going to be in the data center, I know, is exponentially going to cost not only more money in the initial deployment, it's going to generate more revenue. That's the whole point of the data center, is to protect what we would say is the most valuable commodity on Earth, short of your personal health. It's data, right? It's the ideas of the whole world. And so I'm gonna build an infrastructure, and sometimes I'm like, look, if this is whatever the number is, $1 million, $10 billion, it doesn't matter. In this abstract example, the land is probably the least expensive piece over the life cycle. I've converted a facility in downtown Atlanta that used to be a Sears and Roebuck warehouse for distributing their catalogs. They built what's called a 200-year building. If you go into that place, I'll bet you it's longer than 200 years we're going to have that thing. And so the life cycle of that facility, whatever the internal iterations are, both of the gear or the infrastructure to support the gear, as it gets changed, slabs get reinforced, roofs get changed, whatever, the land, then the facility on the land, in the big scheme of things, is far and away less expensive. So if somebody can buy the land speculatively, or maybe not even speculatively, again, I've said this before, we may be early, but we're not going to be wrong. Yep. We go reserve it. We hold on to it. My CEO years ago went to Richmond. It's one of my favorite stories to tell. And there was a Cumonda chip fab. And several years before that, maybe 5 years before that, they had shut it down because all the chips were being manufactured in Indonesia or Malaysia, I forget where. But they built that. It was like less than a 15-year-old facility for $1.1 billion. My CEO, not knowing any better, quote unquote, and our then president went down there, and I'm pretty sure this is my reading into it. He's never said this to me. Said to the real estate, because this place was up for auction, 100 megawatt substation, 50 meg in an M+1 config, with the ability to double the entire property and the substation if you needed to, all these other things. And they told the real estate community or whoever, yeah, we're probably going to bid $150 million for it. We didn't have $150 million, but we told it. Nobody showed up at the auction. I mean, I'm telling you, my CEO is a genius. So they show up to auction, just these two people, and they buy it. Have you heard this story before?
No.
Do you know how much they bought that facility for? $12 million. $12 million, and then we recycled the copper out of it, and we got about $12 million for recycling the copper. So you get this 100-year, 200-year manufactured, multi-story. That chip line can't move. That concrete has to be so deep, so strong, so hard. People, we love to do greenfields, but we'll do a brownfield in a second. It's got the big, heavy. What didn't it have, and why the world laughed at him? $12 million even. They said, "You're a fool.
Right.
You're a fool for doing this." We maybe had an ISDN line from one place, like almost no connectivity.
Yep.
Nobody's laughing at us now.
Cheapest
Dropped a
utility,
C cable. Like you can, and he said this right. And my CTO agreed with him, and my chief growth officer, and these other people. He's like, "You give me that land, I'll resell it if it doesn't work out."
Yeah.
Like this facility, these kinds of things. The Chicago Sun-Times building, where the whole world calls it a river, we call it a aqueduct next to it, or whatever, a canal. It's a canal. Whatever it is, look, we're going to generate more and more data. Mm-hmm. It's spectacularly valuable. We know these things, and it needs to live in an always on, always available, always secure facility. Tiny one, large one, everything in between. And so they would get these. So we look for these things. So to your point about who's going to pay that reservation fee, or we would call it an opportunity fee on that pipeline. Yeah, I might have it for 2 years, but if I do connect, in the big scheme of the investment, it's not the most expensive.
Exactly.
And these environments that we're putting in now, if I'm building a $10 billion or $100 million data center, multiply that times 100 or 1,000, the infrastructure that's going to go in and then come out and go in and come out over that 100 or 200 year life cycle. That's the way. Now, will it all be the same? 20 years ago, we were sticking in plasma TVs or whatever it was into our house. And now you're putting an 80-inch. I had to go by Best Buy to get a present today. Dan, I confess, I lusted. My faith tradition says, don't have any altars. I stopped in the doorway because they had a 100-inch, and the SEC champ at the time of this recording is coming up.
Oh, gosh.
100-inch LED TV that I'll bet you could lift with a hand. You certainly wouldn't need two people, except for maybe to coordinate it, to hook it to the wall. That I don't know if they're 8K, quantum dot, Hubble telescope, whatever this thing. I wanted it. I could imagine a Georgia and an Auburn helmet running across the screen and life size across that thing. Like the more we use, the more we want. We're not going to, but it's so spectacular. I guarantee you it runs on 1/50th of the power of my first plasma screen
and
that dimmed the lights.
Probably.
That costs, maybe the same. So my point is just that land and that facility, whether there's 10 servers in it or 10,000 as we grow and compress that, whatever their mission is. So some of us that come from that world, we understand the opportunity cost. Not everybody does, especially if they're public and you got to justify quarter over quarter, not private. But even then, you'll do unnatural behavior. You might, you got to be sophisticated in doing this. But it's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about that, but we're familiar with it from other perspectives.
Well, and that's true in so many trends and things, is the people that are willing to take the risk.
Pull your mic just a little bit closer.
The people that are willing to take the risk on the front end. And, buy when other people think is crazy, but they understand the direction that things are moving.
Yeah.
And I mean, I put up a clip at our our annual meeting a couple months ago that was, I think it was 2005 newspaper clipping that was talking about how the internet was a bubble and a fad still, and so I completely agree with you. Like, and I think that also goes to the density is what matters. The density of data centers and the electrical density of everything at this point is just continuing to go nuts. And so part of the biggest challenge in exactly what you're talking about there, right, is if you build a data center right now that is, 72 megawatts critical, 100 108 megawatts utility, when you go through a refresh 3 to 5 years from now, it's not going to surprise me at all if that's a 300 megawatt building. 5, 8, 9 years from now, it becomes a 500 megawatt building 10 years from now.
Right.
So understanding how to build infrastructure in a way that's going to scale with that, because rebuilding that stuff every time you're having to refresh what's going inside is going to be really, really difficult. Yeah. Not just expensive,
right,
but difficult.
Yeah.
And that's one of the big problems and things that we're solving for a lot of people that we're working with right now on the 2 to 5 gigawatt density type stuff is how do you future-proof this and make it so that, one, you can get it up and going fast, 2, how it can scale as quickly as you want to scale it, but then 3, just as importantly, on this long-term life cycle of this building campus, however that's being built, making sure that you're forward thinking about how you're going to deal with this in the future. And this is something we've been doing forever in the industrials. I mean, we built our first private transmission, private substations, on-site generation microgrid 10 years ago. Right. This isn't new. It's at a bigger scale than it's ever been before. But that's part of the world continuing to evolve and change, and the electrical density of everything getting more intense.
I don't know if we have well, I'm just going to be partisan for a second. I think organizations like ours that come from an IT DNA, if you talk to anybody in the IT business, there's always 3 things that you have to balance: compute, network, and storage. Whether that's within a chassis, they're connected. So when we talk about AI, usually talk about the GPU, but there's the network to connect them to storage. The closer you can get the storage, but that's always, whether you talk about the cloud, virtualization before that, personal computing, mainframes, it doesn't matter. Those are the 3 legs of that stool. And those engineers and the people that work in them have unique mindsets on how compute works or whatever, but they've also had to develop skills at communication between them. And they all know whatever I do, or the successful ones know, whatever I'm doing in compute, I better make sure I'm in communication with these guys. Here's a great example. I built this whole great big environment. It's amazing. Nobody's going to get these cat videos better, or this sermon, or this SEC stream, or whatever it is. And what happens, do you think, especially in the late 80s, early 90s, of every company's IT group on a Sunday afternoon about 5, they run their backups. But nobody talked to the network people. So now all of a sudden, your whole network is crashing, and the computers can't do what they want because of all the congestion. It's like being in Dallas or Austin when all of a sudden we overbuild here, but we don't build the infrastructure to support it. Or we got all the roads right, but we didn't get the parking lots right, or whatever it is, right? I got to have these things in balance. And so while we may not know what it is in the power world, what the things that have to be in balance are, but we know they have to be in balance. It usually is in 3s, maybe more. It's never 1 or 2. It's in these 3 things of, I'm doing the work, I got to move the work, I got to store or access the work, whatever that is. So we talked a little bit about transmission or whatever. I'm also eyeing the time because I need to get you out of here in the not too distant future to get on an airplane. I do not want to trap you in Atlanta. It was recovering from the holidays. But this is where I think, at least in part, why this idea of on-site generation, microgrid, whatever we want to call it. Now, in general, I would say data centers have some familiarity with microgrids because we use UPS infrastructure. In other words, we've got small environments. They're able to carry us through for a period of time, right? While if there's an outage with, utility or if we're in maintenance mode on something or whatever. So on a very modest scale, we understand the basic concept of a microgrid. We're talking about orders of magnitude of that. Now, I think, and not just data centers, if we're trying to reshore any critical infrastructure that's going to be doing steel or any kind of manufacturing at scale, chips, whatever, we're going to have this infrastructure not to replace utility, but to supplement utility, partner utility, whoever owns and operates the microgrid, whatever it is. Maybe we get into that. But for sure to accelerate or at least help relieve some of the pressure that we see happening. So can you help us to understand, for the audience that doesn't know about UPS and data centers, what a microgrid is from your perspective? And then I also want to get into why that's attractive. I got some other questions about it, and then let's talk about some of the energy topologies. So let's start with microgrids.
So just kind of back to the comment you just had, we actually saw something similar to that coordinated backups happen in Texas this summer, where we have a massive deployment of batteries now in Texas. I think there's 6 gigs on the grid now. And batteries really right now are just mainly just doing arbitrage.
Okay.
And what happened for the first time ever is a whole bunch of batteries dispatched against the grid peak. And it was on I can't remember if it was a Thursday or Friday. Or it was earlier in the week than that. I think it was on Wednesday maybe. And so prices were cheaper the following days, but still not that cheap. And then on a Sunday, the price finally got down to the point where the software that all the battery companies happened to all be using decided that they should all charge. So all of these batteries hopped on the grid on a Sunday and charged and actually reset the peak for the entire month on a Sunday, which has never happened on a weekend before, and kind of violated the whole concept of small fish swim free, except if someone's coordinating all small fish. So there's a lot of unintended consequences of things that are happening right now. And this kind of goes back to how dynamic these markets are. This is the most inelastic commodity on earth. There is no other commodity on earth that can go from negative $20 to $5,000 in 15 minutes.
Wow.
And then back down. And then back up. Right. So the volatility in this, if you don't understand how all that works, it's dangerous. It's violent. So building a microgrid or building the data center and transmission is just the beginning. It's like the first inning of the game. And so when you look at a microgrid and what that is, it can be comprised of a number of things, but obviously you're going to have generation. You might have some battery infrastructure associated with that. You're going to have a private use network of how that's distributed, across, similar to a big chemical plant or a lot of these, even a data center in and of itself is kind of a microgrid. The fact that it's got its own generation backup and can, island itself if it needs to. And one of the big evolutions I think we've seen in the data center, I remember 10 years ago talking to a data center about trying to bid one generator into demand response or using it for economic dispatch. And it was like, no, that's there to not run. So these don't ever run. And we run them for a test once, that's it, period. In a lot of cases, their SLA wouldn't let them do that. We've seen that change. So in a microgrid, which we're working on a number of these projects right now, where you can actually build a campus, build centralized generation, and totally change the way that you interact with the grid now, where you're now managing both market risk and capacity challenges for the data center as far as their scaling, and then you also have the opportunity to turn around and help the grid and do a lot of very interesting things. And I think one of the really important components that people are starting to understand, but I don't think we all fully understand yet, but people really need to be eyes wide open on when we're talking about loads of these size, is a lot of these data centers look like an arc furnace, not a data center. And you now have the ability for a software glitch to turn on dozens or maybe even hundreds of megawatts and then turn them back on and then turn them back off and that instability will wreck a grid. Like literally the email I was sending before we got in here was a massive manufacturing plant that is getting knocked offline for 24 hours.
Will they oscillate their loads or something?
Well, no. So we were having a problem with the transmission grid where they were getting knocked down for like a third of a second. And that is enough to take that plant down, and it takes them 24 hours to get back up again. right?
Yeah.
So when you start oscillating and messing with grids like that and you create a voltage sag,
Right.
that can have reverberating effects on a transmission grid out 100 miles.
Right.
So understanding how all that's going to work in a microcosm on a microgrid, and some of these microgrids we're working on are only 100, 200 megawatts. Some of them are gigs.
Right.
Those have their own interesting and unique dynamics, which a lot of it's going to be driven by the data center. So understanding what the data center is doing and in real time. And when I say real time, I'm talking intrasecond.
Right.
Real time.
Right.
And understanding how all that's going to coordinate, and then how is that interacting with the market? I mean, there's utilities in Texas right now that are paying $20 to $25 million a year for the next 28 years on a bond because of what happened to a couple hundred megawatts of their generation in 1 week. Like that's how, I mean, you can lose tens of millions in a few hours and hundreds of millions in a day or two. And so understanding how all these things are going to actually interact in a microgrid and with that market, regulated or deregulated,
Right.
is a really key aspect for the next phase of this journey. And some of this we're going to find out as we go.
Yeah. So how do organizations like ours engage in that, not fearfully, but with a seriousness to make sure, I don't want to say money when you're talking about billions of dollars is the least of your concern, but safety is our number one thing around here,
Yep.
safety and culture. How do you get involved in that?
I think, it's where we live. And the fun part about it, kind of to my nerd, is it's a symphony.
Right.
And all of these things have to be, between your gas infrastructure, gas markets, power infrastructure, power markets, and your regulatory environment, all of those things have to be in sync, both for safety and financial sustainability, and to just be able to accomplish what you're
Right.
trying to accomplish.
Right.
And when one of those things gets out of whack, everything falls apart very quickly. And so, one of the interesting things that we're seeing in that space is there's a lot of big announcements being made about, hey, this is what we're going to do, and we're dedicating $50 billion to go do it. And we know that those things are at least 5 years, probably 10,
Right.
from coming to fruition.
Right.
But it's been interesting to see, there's a whole bunch of different, some of the folks you've had on here are renting generation to these folks as a temporary solution until power shows up. Others, we're helping them actually build, power plants that they either want to own and operate or they don't want to own and operate more often than
Right.
not. And then there's, the whole microgrid campus style stuff that we're working on and talking to as well. And all of these things are playing out in kind of different forms as this whole process evolves, and that evolution is going to continue over the next 36 to 60 months. And that's where I think you'll see some of these models really start to play now, which comes back to the whole, do we want data centers just spread all over the place where we randomly found small 200 megawatt-ish, 500 megawatt pockets of power?
Right.
Or do we want to build in areas that we really understand the risk, we really understand how we're going to be able to scale, and we have some real solid longevity here to anchor around?
Right.
And fiber is the cheapest of the infrastructures to build.
Right.
And to your point earlier, we're talking to some of these fiber folks, and they're being asked for fiber in bigger quantities at a
Right.
time now than they ever have before.
Right.
As well.
Yeah.
And so managing all of that complexity is a symphony. And that's one of the decisions that a lot of the data center builders are making right now is, do I really want to get into that game? Because that's not what I do. And there's a tremendous amount of risk involved in it financially and physically. Or do I want to work with somebody else to own, operate, and manage that and design, build it? And, we've seen situations, especially with midstream pipes, where
Right.
they'll eat your lunch if
Right.
you let them.
Yeah.
And so helping folks like you guys
Right.
understand, hey, that doesn't cost $40 million, that costs 20.
Right.
And here's how we should go about doing it, not that way, because that's going to reduce your OpEx, by $3 million a year in perpetuity.
Right.
So those are a lot of the challenges that to me that's the fun part, right?
Yeah.
Is how is the sausage made?
That makes sense. Look, there are a lot of people that are in the data center business. Some of them operate data centers. Some of them build, purpose-built, or even the hyperscales build their own and operate their own. There are a few of us that are part of the design process, that are part of the build process. We're for sure, we own almost all of our stuff. That's our desire. We operate it. We maintain it. And over the course of 20 years, there are things that were part of our business that aren't part of that. So so I can get where you would want to play in any one of those things. I don't want to own the building. Somebody else can do that. Or maybe I own the building, but somebody else maintains it for me, whatever the combination of things are. I just know it is a challenge. It is not an easy thing. And it is at least as complicated as what we do now, or even what we've learned from the IT stack. It's probably orders of magnitude harder than that, because the industries are learning themselves as we go. So if we're talking microgrid, you've mentioned gas a lot. There are a number of energy sources. In a few moments, why would something qualify itself or be more attractive than another one? And from my perspective, I don't know anything about this world. I'm pretty agnostic. I get not concerned. I don't know. When somebody is pitching me, this is the only, when somebody's saying this is the only energy source, no others will work here. Yeah. That gets me anxious. Like, are we picking winners or losers? Does this one work better here in the middle of the Nevada desert? Does this one work better for base load? Does this one work better for oscillating? Is this one more accessible? We have so much of it. We're flaring it off into the atmosphere. Like, does this one meet our long-term sustainability goals? Like, how do we, when you think about them, not just the now, but in this, this feels like it's going to be going on, maybe not at the same pace, but for perpetuity. Where do these different sources, what role do they play, and how do you think about them?
So I think, the tagline of Legend is don't just use better energy, use energy better.
Okay.
And there's a ton of focus on green energy and how you're sourcing energy, right? So that's all great. But understanding how you're using energy and using that more efficiently is really what matters. The greenest kilowatt hours is the one you don't use.
Right.
So at the same time, though, energy density is what really matters, right?
Okay.
And data centers are by far and away the poster child for that.
What do you mean by energy density?
So the volume of energy that's being used in a concentrated place, right? So, you've gone from 1 kW racks to, now NVIDIA's got a 600 kW.
Right.
We'll call it a rack. It's not a rack anymore.
Right.
It's still in a rack
Something
format,
else,
but,
yeah.
And eventually it'll be a megawatt rack.
Right.
And, whatever. So the energy intensity, you think about the electrical density of a car that's an electric vehicle, wildly more dense, much heavier than a gas-powered car.
Right.
So how you generate energy in a dense form also has a lot of material importance. And then also, is it intermittent, right? So a data center is going to use a boatload of power in a very dense place. And oh, by the way, I want 500 nines.
Right.
It never can even blink, not for a cycle.
You energy people so exaggerate. Just 5. Just 5.
Right. So when you think about energy sources, all of this comes into play, right? So, wind, for example, it looks very different on the coast than it looks inland, than it looks all the way offshore.
Right.
So there's a density benefit to going offshore. Are there a whole bunch of environmental costs in putting that stuff out there? And, what kind of impact does it have on the marine environment, both on the seafloor as well as, mammals that communicate via sonar?
Right.
Same thing with solar panels, right? Is solar, if you think about how much energy from the sun actually hits a solar panel versus how much is converted. And listen, the same thing's true on gas. Like a gas turbine that's not combined cycle is not very efficient, but it's always there and responds like that.
Right.
I mean, not exactly like that, but very quickly, right? Not as fast as a diesel, which can block load. Right. And then we have nuclear, right? So, and I've been a proponent of nuclear for a long time. People have laughed at me forever. And now in the last 18 months, all of a sudden everybody's a fan.
Right. Nobody loves a prophet in their own home, somebody once said, right? Look, isn't that the kid that used to make the chairs and the tables? Who does he think he is?
Well, but the reality is, like, for the last 50 years, we've kind of pushed that aside, other than France and some other countries that have, really implemented. And don't get me wrong, like, I don't know, maybe not 50 years from now, but I think at some point in the future, your car will come with a reactor that's probably the size of your coffee cup that will run it for the life of the car, just like our new submarines have a reactor in it that's fueled up that will run for the life of the submarine. Now they're getting to use weapons-grade fuel. So all of these energy sources play a role. Right. And you have to have, reliability. You can't have just intermittency all the time. But no one out there wants a dirty planet and to waste money.
Right.
Like those are two things that no one that's sane wants to do. Everybody wants to live in a cleaner environment. Everybody wants to save money. And no one really likes the lights going off. Right. So all of these three things have to balance. And understanding how all these energy sources work together to make that happen.
Can I add one more to that?
Yes.
Affordable.
Affordable, yeah.
Right?
Although,
it's got to be.
But here's the thing, like in this is another big shift in the data center world, right? It was all about what is my cost per kilowatt hour, and I'm going to locate a data center here because power is cheaper than there.
Right.
You're seeing deals get done right now that aren't very economic.
Right.
But it's
I was speaking at the macro. If you're talking about, it's got to be available.
Totally.
It's got to be safe. It's got to be as clean as we can get it because we want to live in a clean world. Like we know what paradise looks like. We got to eat on our way to paradise. So how do we do that? I had Professor Donald Sadoway here. He did a great TED Talk a number of years ago. He's professor at MIT. Talked about energy storage. If you're really going to talk about clean, when he says clean, he means intermittent. If you're talking about intermittent energy, you got to have energy storage. He also makes really clean, pure aluminum with electricity. But to do it from the grid, it's too expensive and it's too hard. But when you can get nuclear or whatever, that will be pure, perfect aluminum. It's amazing. But what he said was, if we really want to get serious, there are places on Earth still that are burning wood. If you replace that with clean coal, you just exponentially dropped your carbon footprint. Now, don't get me wrong, he said. I'm not trying to say clean coal works everywhere. Maybe it doesn't work anywhere. I'm just saying if our goal are these things, where it's available, nuclear to him at the time, not to put words in his mouth, but I believe was like, look, that's wonderful. Natural gas, like all of these things. He's pro solar and wind or whatever, but they have to fit the purpose, the workload you're trying to do, the geographic location that you're trying to do it in, and what are the unintended consequences as we learn. If a blade catches on fire on that turbine, how do you put it out? What's the consequences to the environment? How do you recycle it? And what's the impact to that turbine if it goes down to the grid or whatever it's serving? He's not
the life cycle cost of producing it.
For sure. So he's not anti any of them. He's just saying, what's the total cost of ownership? Let's do that. And we've got to balance these things to your point of safety, cleanliness, affordability, and reliability to the load that it's serving.
And I think that is, to me, anytime someone's making an empirical statement of this is the best and all of that is the worst, and that's that's not reality in life.
Reality. That's right.
And so having and I think that's happening right now, is we've seen a big shift of like, okay, if you really want this volume of power and you want it in this level of density and you don't want to build massive amounts of transmission lines, like in the very near term, it's gas. It's the only thing that can scale that fast and is that reliable and is that dense. And so there's going to be look at the transition we've seen of the generation stack over the last 15 to 20 years. I mean, I was, in the energy space when we were going through this literally every day, gas to coal switching and that kind of battle that really pushed, the market is a huge part of what pushed coal out of the stack. Now, there was all sorts of regulatory stuff that was around that. But, natural gas became wildly cheap to the point, we've had months where it's literally less than free. You're getting paid to burn it.
Wow.
Waha balance of month in August traded at like a negative $1.50.
Wow.
So understanding all of these dynamics and how they're working together and how all of this is transitioning, and that is the energy transition, right? Everything's moving toward electricity because electricity is so much more dense than burning wood. Right. So, and lasers, right? That's all your fiber optics, all getting powered by lasers, which is a super dense form of energy. And so understanding the mechanics of all of this and how that's going to work to drive the density that we need in compute, which is only going to get more and more and more dense over time, is really the key part of the challenge and, again, the complexity that makes it fun.
But as you're thinking about, and we're talking about natural gas, do you really think that in most places that is going to be, to your densification comment, that's going to be probably the most common if you're doing a microgrid, as opposed to some of these others? And do you think the others will catch on? I mean, solar's here, wind is here. There will be, whether they're feeding the public utility or grids. We use solar in a number of places for a variety of roles in our data centers. So I'm not trying to pick a winner or loser. I just mean that
they're all going to play a part.
do you really think that natural gas is, from your perspective, if you're in your industry hat trying to solve this microgrid problem, that is far and away the most affordable, whatever, whether it ends up being a bridging, I hear this all the time, that it could be a bridging to something else. Here's why I caution around the idea of bridging. I know from the IT stack, if I build out 100 megabyte infrastructure and somebody tells me they future-proofed it because they put gig switches in there, I guarantee you I'm going to come back. I'm probably not going to touch this infrastructure that's deployed because to disrupt production is so hard. I'll leave it and just change the role that it plays and move the newer stuff onto newer stuff. Could be fiber, or could be whatever. InfiniBand is what we're talking about now for AI stuff. But whatever it is, I'm going to shift my load. I'm probably not going to have a bunch of technicians. It happens, but it's very uncommon to rip out the bridging infrastructure and put in new infrastructure. So how do you think about that?
So, one, I think solar is going to play a huge demand long term a huge role at demand long term. Solar roofs and all these things, especially at the load, which again kind of goes back to this whole question of transmission and being able to generate as much power as you can where it's needed. Yeah. Because there's loss in transmission, there's cost in transmission, and there's waste in transmission. So I think all of these things are going to play a role. Right now, if you're looking for density, speed, and reliability, it's gas, or gas. That's reality,
Sounds like
right?
me at Taco Bell.
Well, if you need 300 megawatts of solar or 300 megawatts of power,
right?
Like you can't combine solar and wind. You need a boatload of land to do it, and you still don't have the reliability that you need.
That's right.
So, I absolutely think storage is going to continue to proliferate. There's obviously a lot of mineral challenges there. There's a whole bunch of new technology that's being worked on. So all of this stuff is evolving, which again, I think is why you can't say, well, this is what it's going to be and that's what it's going to be. Nuclear has some very unique characteristics to it that it is wildly dense, more dense than anything, can run very reliably for very long periods of time, and I think is only going to get better and stronger and more dense. And the beauty of a lot of these new technologies is a lot of the waste that we have right now is still very active, which is why it's waste that could be used for fuel.
I've heard that so many times,
But I'm not on the it's here in 2 years, 3 years train. There's so much NIMBY and there's so much technology that has to be figured out. How that throttles and scales the way that our military technology stuff that we're using in nuke works. There's a lot to do there. So that brings it back to the bridging.
Right.
I don't think gas is a bridging fuel for the next 15 years. I think it's used for a very long time.
Right.
Because of its flexibility, intermittency, and its abundance. I think as we, continue to move forward, you look at over the last 100 years of all sorts of things that we thought were awesome until we realized they were not.
Right.
So that's going to continue to happen.
I feel like you just called out my 8th grade haircut. Like that's what flashed in my mind. Like,
they're back, man.
Up.
They're back.
Look at that. My sophomore year in high school, you're like, that's why you kissed nobody until you were 16 years old. But that what came out of your mouth.
One of the three.
I mean, that makes complete sense to me. I am so bullish on the potential of whether they're micro or small modular reactors, whatever they look like.
They're working on nuclear diamond batteries that'll power your phone.
Nuclear diamond
for
batteries.
a decade.
We get to talk to some of the National Lab folks on occasion. The things that they're experimenting and trying with fusion. So I'm only talking about fission now, but just some fusion ideas. Like, tomorrow will be today for somebody in these things. But like you said, even when I talk to the nuclear people, not those that have a nuclear company, but the people that are part of the nuclear space, they're researchers or they're proponents or they're government officials, they're 100% in. They're also not anti-other forms at all, which
there's
is
interesting
I love.
stuff going on in geothermal.
They're super interested in it. But they also want to say, hey, look, don't get caught up in the hype cycle about people that are marketing things for nuke, as opposed to there are only 2, I might be getting this wrong, but I'm pretty sure there's only 2 approved SMR designs to one form or the other. At the very least, there isn't like a dozen.
Yeah.
There are things that we're working through. There's regulation that the government is eagerly getting. One of the only places I've seen them actually eager. They want to be safe. They're
Yep.
going to be safe. They're not losing their charter for that. But there also have we unnecessary obstacles
Yep.
to getting to power densification because it's energy sovereignty. Whatever it's used for, we know you're not a modern society. You're not a society without energy that's clean and safe and affordable and all these other things, and connectivity.
Yep.
You're not connected to the world if that's true. If that's not true, and if that's the case, well then you're in poverty and it's a disaster, or you've made whatever you're going to make and you're living somewhere where you do have everything turned off. So
And that's going to be important. And how do all these technologies evolve and interact with a market that provides reliability and affordability, and you're being a good environmental steward? And I feel like that is something that everybody is on board with.
Yeah. How do you help people, not just with the technology, but the sophistication of the conversation? I want the communities that we work in and work with to embrace us. And I don't want to do, it's my kids and grandkids too. I don't want to, if my organization or any organization we're related to is not working towards human flourishing, not just a paycheck, but their actual flourishing, it's my country, let's call it out.
Yep.
So how do we, is that an accurate concern in how do we help people negotiate through that?
Well, I think, the biggest reason and challenge for that is electricity markets are one of, if not the most complicated things out there. So it's not like gold trading or a lot of other commodities.
Marriage counseling.
Well, that might be more complicated, but that's not a commodity. So fortunately. So if you think about how, capacity, transmission markets, energy markets, ancillary response, responsive reserve markets, demand response, like all of these components are going into, bid stacks and everything else that is all at play and interworking in an electricity market all at the same time. And then you think about how grids are balanced across states. I mean, the entire eastern part of the United States is all synced. The western part's all synced, and then Texas is an island on its own in ERCOT. And so right now especially, there's so much news around this and a lot of sensationalization, and everybody's trying to come out and make an announcement and say this and that, like the PJM auction. Yes, it went up 7 or 9-fold or whatever it did for this year to next year. Okay, but that's like barely twice what it was 3 years ago. So there's a lot of sensationalization going on right now. There's a lot of demonization of data centers. There's a lot of demonization of utilities, generation companies, Wall Street, like all of these things that, people are trying to simplify something that is incredibly complicated. And if you really break down, and this is something we've dealt with forever in the utility space, especially looking at the payback on efficiency projects, right? All of these companies come in, okay, well, this is what your cost, and this was your kilowatt hour, so this is your price per kilowatt hour, and here's how much to save, so that's what it's going to work. Okay, well, no utility building in the world, but for sure North America, is built that way, like zero. There's all sorts of different components. Some are affected by demand, some are affected by usage at different times of day, at different days of the week, different times of the year. Some of them are just set costs.
Weather, temperatures, everything.
All this kind of stuff, right? Some of them are based off the gas market. So understanding the complexity of all that is extremely difficult. And there's a lot of people that are basically trying to take wildly complex things and distill them down into a headline or a very simple story. And it's just not. Power is something that is literally balanced every second, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year across the entire United States, across a very diverse gen stack. And this kind of goes back to managing intermittency with solar and wind and batteries, which are now a generator and a load. And then, nuke, which just wants to turn on and leave me alone. I'll bid in at zero, give me what you will. And then I've got different types of gas, and then I've got some coal that's still on in the Northeast. I still have oil that's in the stack. I've got biomass generation. Like all of these things are being balanced literally every second. And screwing stuff up for a third of a second can have catastrophic effects on different things that are connected to the grid. So I think that's one of the hard parts about this is we are radically transforming the thing that really supports life. I mean, you think about, 50 years ago or 80 years ago, a power outage was really annoying, and you got some candles out and you read some books and you hung out by the fire if it was cold, whatever.
Right.
Now you're shutting down all sorts of things that are from your cell phones to hospitals that now need to roll over to backup
Water
generation.
treatment plant.
Water
everything.
treatment plant. Like there's so much that relies on the it's really fundamental to the lifeblood of our society.
Right. It's catastrophic. When you said that, I would say that I can imagine repeating this to I have 3 daughters in their 20s. They'd be like, well, I got a candle app. You're missing the point. You're not.
And my phone has a
never
battery.
Mind. That's right. When I was a kid, I drove across the country back to California a couple times to Fort Benning, now Fort Moore. And my kids were shocked to learn we didn't even have the Rand McNally book. We had a fold-out map. I get on the blue line that says 20, or take the blue line on 65 to 10, and go that way. Well, how would you know to go off? When I got to the ocean, like there were signs and you had to look out the window and not at your phone. Like, I don't know how to tell you this. And we would freak out if we heard about George Washington at 16 or 17 years old on his horse surveying Virginia for months at a time by, just kind of, well, the stars are over here and this is how the things, and these are the different people groups that live here.
And the accuracy was amazing.
Amazing. It's incredible. Once upon a time we didn't even have keels on boats, and we've learned to do these things. I guess for me in that conversation, and maybe it's just part of the world that we're going through, when I get close to people like you or utility providers or whoever that are really near this, they have more often than not a lot of grace for their compatriots that are tied to this thing because they recognize the complexity. But the further I get away to people that are reporting on it, only if, or I don't even know, and I don't even necessarily like big media, but just people that are sort of, they've heard something that's got them concerned. They do a form of investigation, whatever that looks like, and then they come back. And I'm not saying it's, they're trying to be misleading at all, but it's not complete. Would you get a representative from a variety of energy generation, a variety of big consumers, a variety of citizens that are impacted in their mind positively or negatively, like all of them. And let's have a conversation and find out where we're missing, where we're succeeding, more data as you understand it. Because to your point, it is lifeblood. And very similar in the same way, if we're talking about electricity, we're also talking about data. Electricity without data, data without electricity is not the cancer treatment or finding your kid on her. I'm just as addicted. I tease my daughters all the time, but when they go into Atlanta for a concert, my wife gives me a hard time because I'm on my app watching where they don't even know this. They never listen to my podcast, thank God. But I know about where they are because Papa Bear, even though my wife's like, you got to, and I do. They don't know I'm 2 blocks back. But if I need to, they have no idea. But I'm just telling you, you don't want to, this is my life. Whatever else happens, it's my life. These are my kids. And so I use these technologies, hopefully for human flourishing. But I'm not saying in every argument, I've got it right and and I've got it perfectly balanced. But I think it's more nuanced than just a negative or a overglowing. It's only positive. There are consequences, whether it's right away or whatever, as there always has been when we build infrastructure. But we got to build the infrastructure because it is what leads to our future human flourishing here. And as we expand out into the stars or whatever, we need to do it.
Well, and what's really important too is the sheer volume of capital that is being deployed right now. I mean, it's maybe not once in a lifetime, but it's certainly once in a generation.
Sure.
And capital is trying to figure out how to deploy intelligently. And there's a lot of national strategic.
Right.
Who wins the AI race is going to have a big impact on the future of the world.
Having your own power without having to leave your borders. Right. Certainly your continent, as we see in the world today, is spectacularly important.
But I think capital is struggling too with so much of like the headlines that we're talking about and trying to separate fact from fiction. And, we've been talking to a lot of folks on Wall Street that are deploying a lot of capital right now and helping them understand, because there's billions of dollars that are going to get set on fire in the next 3 years easily.
Right.
Just because of all these people that didn't know what a data center was 3 years ago, didn't know what a power plant was a year ago, are diving in and doing this and doing that. And capital is trying to figure out where to go, because it's also speed is everything right now. And so that's another huge component of this, is for both debt and equity trying to figure out how to participate and enable this, and enable it in a sustainable way, and enable it in a strategic way, and not just getting completely boondoggled, which there's a lot of that. I mean, it's amazing to watch some of the things that are happening right now. And some of that is just you're having to do things in a way you never would have before. I mean, some of the things that you need to do as an on-site power plant is something that a regular power plant would never even consider. But if you're trying to have the reliability and redundancy that you need to make this work, especially in a microgrid situation, you're going to do things very differently than they've been traditionally done. And understanding the physical dynamics of that, and then understanding the market dynamics and how those two things are going to interact, is really what's going to separate the people that are doing that well, that are going to succeed, and the people that are doing that are going to get shredded.
So I got 3 quick questions. First is, do you tend to be optimist or pessimist?
Optimist.
Okay. What you imagine is true, not being hallucinated by the real load, not just data center industry, just the things that are going to stress both the public grid and the microgrid infrastructure that gets built and used. Do you have an idea, this is a slippery slope, I know, of the order of magnitude that it's going to be? And 2, or a range. And 2, what would be the milestones? Like, how would we know if we're on track for that? And maybe it's not just as simple as, what are we consuming? Because it takes a while to build this infrastructure. But you're an optimist. So from your optimistic but obviously trained, seasoned view, what does this growth look like, at least in North America? And what are the milestones that people should be looking at to make sure I'm getting closer to the California coast from Fort Benning or back on time and on point?
So I think the velocity of capital right now makes it really hard to tell what's working and what's not, because everything's working right now because there's just so much liquidity.
Right.
I think the first milestone is going to be about 36 months from now.
Okay.
Because a lot of this capital is going to be deployed, and AI demand, which I believe is a long-term thing, is going to continue to actually get deployed, developed, and used. There's so much being developed around that. Right. At the same time, the electrification of everything is continuing because it's just convenient. So I think the first gate is going to be around the 36-month mark, but for sure before 2030.
Okay.
Of seeing how much of this stuff is successfully scaled. And I think some of it is going to be how many projects fail, blow up, cause problems, and how quickly do we learn, or how agile are we at avoiding those altogether? And I think that's the benefit of looking back and having been through, Uri and a lot of these really bizarre events that happen in energy markets, over the last 15 years.
Yeah.
So I'm absolutely bullish that this is a long-term trend. The electrification of everything is going to continue, and I think it's going to continue to be a somewhat logarithmic curve for a long time. Just because, to your point, like all of this data that we're creating has to live somewhere, and I think one of the biggest areas is going to be industrial robotics.
Sure.
Are going to replace so many things, and all of that has data. All of that is learning. All of that is just doing all of this stuff that's going to contribute to AI on top of just AI itself in all the other places that AI is going to play.
Right.
And so how well that's executed over the next 36 months and how many projects really run into problems is going to be the first litmus test. I think the real big one is around 2030.
Okay.
And that, I think, really determines the trajectory of where things go. Because that, to me, the 36 months to 2030 range is kind of where the bubble's going to hit, if it's going to hit. And how bad is that? And then who's going to make it through?
Do you think we're talking, and this maybe, I'm not even going to guess, I heard my friend Jonathan Schildkraut the other day say, he was on our friend David Liggett's podcast, and I might get the number wrong, but it was a big gigawatt number. He said it's going to look something like this. Now, he was talking about, I believe, data center opportunities.
Yep.
Do you think we're looking at 25 gigawatts, 40 gigawatts, 100 gigawatts, or just too hard to tell? Not even worth a guess.
Well, no, I don't think it's too hard to tell, and just that we're seeing some of the interconnection and growth numbers. Do I think South Dallas is a 40 gigawatt market in the next? People, they all want to get.
Depends on the Cowboys. Right now, I'm not sure. Every year, Jerry tells us it's going to happen. I'm like, I don't know if you see that. I got my Houston Oiler hat up there, so I'm a glutton for punishment. But we'll see. Texas does a number of things amazing, and most of my family lives there. I love them, but predicting outcomes, I don't know. Who did A&M lose to earlier this year?
Earlier this year?
Yeah.
Auburn beat them in overtime.
Auburn.
That wasn't earlier this year. This was like 2 weeks ago.
If you had asked A&M if that was going to happen, if you had asked anybody at Texas that they were going to lose to Georgia, we would have said, absolutely not. And then, of course, those of us at Georgia were like, we're on our way then, national championship. And we get blown up by Ole Miss and, hot mess afterwards. But anyway.
Well, Texas might get 3 shots at you guys.
they just might. They just may. That's not uncommon for a Longhorn. But the reason why I asked this question is, again, I feel like that's like we've got our perspective when we talk to our customers and we talk to energy providers, but that's part of where we started in this beginning, like what's real, what's true. But we're used to, like, we'll do stuff incrementally. Like, we build data centers. And, in the early days of data centers, if you're building a 50 megawatt data center, you commission the entire thing. So that's a lot of capital stranded for a while. Those days are gone. We don't, unless it's for a building. There are some deployments where you're launching an aircraft carrier. It's got to have everything part of it, the crew, everything. It's got a mission. It's assigned. Just get it through sea trials and go. And other times, no, you're building a village. And you're going to do it in increments, and you do the permitting and the whatever. And then as it grows, we know it's going to get full, but it may accelerate or decelerate depending upon market conditions. So I know it's a crazy idea, but between now and 2030, if even that's the right range, do you think at least for that 3 to 5 year tranche, there's a number that you think is the right target number, maybe as a co-milestone that people are at least going to take down either through microgrids or those interconnects, or do you think it's hard to predict?
So here's what I would struggle to come up with an exact number, but I'll tell you this.
Okay.
I believe that the demand for AI outstrips the supply chain. And so it doesn't actually matter whether, it's going to be a combination of microgrids and the overall grid infrastructure. When you're waiting for interconnections and going about it that way, you just have a whole lot of risk that you can't control. Where in a microgrid situation, you actually can control your supply chain risk, in a way that you can't otherwise. But the reality is there's only so much capacity for turbines, recips, breakers. SF6 breakers are becoming a long lead pole, and transformers, and then cutouts and insulators and wire and a lot of this stuff are. I don't think those are the choke points, but only so much of that can get manufactured. And these are very expensive, very big pieces of equipment. And I think a lot of those manufacturers who have watched this kind of stagnation for 20 years are still trying to figure out if this is really long-term and are they going to ramp up. And some of them are. I was talking to one of the engine manufacturers. They're opening up another line. But that in this next 36 months to 2030 is going to be the choke point. I think this is where the litmus test is. Does AI continue to outrun that supply chain for the next 60 months? Or does it not? If it doesn't, I think that's going to start to cause some pause of people going, okay, wait a minute, where is this going? But my gut is it's going to outrun it. Now, there's going to be individual projects, and I've seen several of them. Like, okay, that's crazy and that's going to fail, but $1 billion just got thrown at it.
Right.
And that's some of that capital that's going to get set on fire, and realize that they're running into a buzzsaw in a couple of different ways. But I think that's going to be part of the litmus test: is the supply chain, does it stay stressed for the next 60 months?
Hard to say. But the demand, I think, it's never ending. We even see it in our data centers now, where that 30 megawatt data center before, or 30 megawatt, might have had, I don't know, however many computers would fit into a 3 kW a rack. Now, because before you even get to GPUs, they're so efficient, where you're learning to use all of the computer in the rack. The output of a watt is so much more efficient for that same 30 megawatts. And we've gotten so much better at using air and using things before we ever get to liquid, which we all are.
Yep.
But we're just exponentially more powerful for that same watt. A lot of people think that those data centers are going to collapse from all those servers down to just a few because they're going to be whatever they are. This is the shape and size of this phone. In fact, why aren't phones, remember we used to have the Flips or the Blackberries, whatever. Why? Because we use them differently now. My kids watch 80% of their content on their phone. The smallest I'll watch is a tablet. I'm like, we'll use the space. It may be for lower density, it may be for pickleball, I don't know what it's going to be for, but we're going to use that space.
In this period right now, with capital flowing as fast and as hard as it is, and most of these projects that are going on right now are 24 to 36 months from completion, that's the point where you're going to start to see who designed this well and who is ready for actually operating, and who made some huge fatal flaws that they didn't understand, that are either going to prevent them from operating the way they thought they were going to operate, or be wildly more expensive than they thought. And then that's what's happening right now. But I agree with you. The demand is at the ceiling, and the pedal's on the floor.
Yeah. And if our frenemies want to make those mistakes, while it's lamentable, I don't mind. We'll just take them over, and it won't be a problem. Dan, we've talked about a lot of things. I need to get you to the airport. What haven't we talked on that we should before we let you go?
I mean, there's only like 6 more hours
of
stuff to talk
Thank you so much for coming on the program.
It's my pleasure.
It was a lot of fun. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. We'll do it again.
Hey, if you liked that, hit the like button. And if you loved it, hit the subscribe button. We'll see you next time, everybody. Have a good one.